Yeah, thank you. It's really a hard job now for me after such an interesting presentation to talk a little bit about methods. I do not only focus on meta-analysis, which I've been asked for in the beginning, but I will extend the topic a little bit to methodological considerations concerning evaluation in general. So this is I also have to say that this is a collaborative work together with Gunnar Lemmer. He's an expert, really an expert in meta-analysis. So if you have any questions concerning meta-analysis, ask him. He knows all the statistical details. I have in focus here primarily perpetrators of hate crimes. So if I'm talking about prevention, my idea is the prevention to prevent that a person becomes a hate crimer. And I'm focusing primarily on effect evaluation, but not so much on process evaluation. We can go back to that in the discussion if you like, but the interesting question for me here is how far can an aim of an intervention or a prevention program really be reached at the end? And finally, from my perspective, from the methodological perspective, intervention and prevention is the same. I have no problems if you interrupt me in between. There are, in principle, two kinds of interventions, and I will focus here primarily on what we call theory-driven intervention. And this is the situation that we have an empirically tested and empirically supported theory. If we can base our intervention on such a theory, chances are good that such an intervention program really reaches that aim that it intends to reach. So if you go back to empirically proven theories, you improve the chances that you really can reach that effect that you intend to reach. Compared to that, we often have, when we talk about intervention, the situation that we either do not have a theory that explains the phenomenon we are interested in. Let's say we have no idea where hate crime might come from or why perpetrators of hate crime became perpetrators. So the question is open. Then we have no chance of theory-driven intervention. The only chance we then have is to introduce some kind of general empowerment to possible perpetrators. An example could be that we try to give all possible perpetrators the chance of a good school education. Education always helps. We have no idea why, but it helps. Or give possible perpetrators good access to the job market. We have no idea why it helps, but this is can be helpful. I will focus here on theory-driven interventions. The question then is, if we base our intervention on scientifically and empirically supported theories, why do we then, in addition, need an evaluation of what we have done? And the answer is, theories usually are tested in a totally different context. In my field, in psychology, we have a lot of laboratory research, experiments, where the theory and the core elements of theories are tested. And the situation, if you run an intervention, is totally different. So it's different participants, and the kind of operationalization your intervention also differs. And this is the reason why evaluation is needed in addition. So this is my first, how do you say it, take-home message in English. Prevention and intervention programs should be driven by empirically supported theory because this increases the chances of success. Coming back to the basic model of theory-driven interventions, the question then is, how can those intervention programs be evaluated? What you usually do in an intervention is you try to realize a certain condition, a certain treatment, and try to measure the effect. Let's say you have a certain treatment where you have good reason to assume that it might reduce hate crime, and then you apply that treatment to a group, and then you measure the effect. Let's say hate crime, whatever that might be. And the result is 3.5. What does it tell you? 3.5 does not tell anything. So one of the basic characteristics of evaluation is comparison. You have to compare your results with comparison, with a comparison level, so to say. And there are different opportunities. You can compare what you find out as a result of your treatment with your expectations. For example, you may plan a anti-hate crime treatment and you expect that this should reduce hate crime to 0. Then you would have an expectation, and 3.5 would tell you something. It's bigger than 0. It differs from your expectation. But in social sciences, we often have the problem that we don't really have good reason for certain expectations. And this means that we have an empirical comparison. And this implies that we have in some way to compare what we find out in our treatment group that participated in a treatment, with a means or a value that is found out in a comparison group. And this is what we typically where typically the differentiation comes in between the treatment group that participates in the treatment, in the intervention, in the prevention program, and we need a control group. But the problem even is some more complicated. If I take, for example, the procedures that you used, go into schools, then you usually have the situation that you have a treatment in one class, and then the idea comes up, okay, we have to compare what comes out after the treatment, the 3.5. What does it mean? We take the mean from the comparison class, from the parallel class. The problem then, however, is that everyone can argue, yeah, but these classes differed already before the treatment came in. So this is a real problem. There are a number of solutions for that problem, and one is what is classical experimental approach, that is to have to randomized assignment to treatment versus control groups. So assume, I come back to that example, you have two classes in the school, two parallel classes in the school. To run a randomized assignment would mean that you bring together pupils from both classes into a big room and to decide by accident which one goes to the treatment group and which one goes to the comparison group. And then you end up with two groups which in a statistical sense are comparable. If you do it by random, then you will have a comparable number of women in the treatment and in the comparison group, and you will have distributed all the other psychological attributes that might be relevant to an equal degree in the treatment and in the control group. However, this is in many cases of evaluation of intervention programs, this is an academic idea, because no headmaster of a school will agree with that. This is not possible to realize. So this is what can be done in psychological experiments with students of psychology, but not in schools. But nevertheless, there are a number of further solutions. One is, for example, that you have non-equivalent groups, but you measure in both groups before the treatment comes and after. And even if there is a difference before the treatment comes between the treatment group, that is that class that participates in the prevention program, and that class that does not participate, even if there might be a difference. But if the difference between the effects is bigger after the treatment, you have a good reason to assume that this bigger difference after the treatment compared to the difference before the treatment goes back to the treatment itself. Another option, which also is often realized, is that you do not introduce a control group, but you take a look only on the treatment group and compare the means that can be observed before the treatment. Then the treatment comes in and you compare that mean with the mean that you observed before the treatment came in. This has a number of disadvantages, and especially your program. We wouldn't have learned so much about your program if we had not had a control group, but nevertheless it's better than nothing. The story behind, however, is that any kind of evaluation has to be planned before any kind of treatment comes in. So if you introduce the treatment and then it comes to your mind, oh, we should evaluate the treatment, then the story is gone already, because you have no access to the effects before the treatment came in. So one has to think before about evaluation, before the treatment is planned, and especially before the treatment is realized. So, two further take-home messages. Second, the evaluation of prevention programs and intervention programs needs comparison. You usually cannot use any data point without an option of comparison. And the third one is, there is no either or. There is no an excellent comparison or an excellent evaluation or no evaluation. There's a lot of qualities in between. If you do an evaluation in a university context, having access to laboratories and so on, you have the chance to do excellent evaluations. But in the field, you often have to accept that there are shortcomings, but nevertheless an evaluation makes sense. So the quality of evaluations can vary, but evaluators should know about the shortcomings of the kind of evaluation they are able to run. Questions? Now to the question what to evaluate. And this is especially, to my impression, especially important if we are talking about evaluation of prevention of hate crime. This is a framework that Olli Christ and I published some years ago, and it's based on Ed Dunbar's results. It is, yeah. McDavid published.
Here's your first mistake.
McDavid published about that, and in Germany, a sociologist, Helmut Willems, did run a number of analyses about possible causes of hate crime, and we call it here, because it comes from another context, group violence, but it is a proxy of hate crime. And what we did here was we differentiated between distal and proximal and situational causes on the one hand, and at second we differentiated between different levels of explanations. Explanations that can be located on the macro level, going down to explanations that can be located at the very micro level, means biological factors, and psychological factors in between. And this is a summary of empirical results that that explain the emergence of hate crime. Take, for example, the distal, far away from what really happened at the end. Take, for example, distal causes, then you all will agree, and there is research about that, that the societal norms or the societal history of, for example, treatment of racism in a society has effects on societies handle hate crimes. Or take on the macro level again economical factors. For example, there is research from the United States that the economic development in the United States southern parts, the Baumwoll price as a proxy, predicts the number of hate crimes. So this is a macro level explanation, but nevertheless it's a valid explanation. And on the other hand, we know a lot about psychological influences on hate crime, as for example, the familial background that helps to understand why a person becomes a perpetrator of hate crime. And in addition to that, we have a number of proximal conditions that can explain hate crime, as for example, we discussed about that, at least for some hate crimers, prejudice, bias is an important predictor of his hate crime, but it can also be readiness of violence, and it can also be, if we think about hate crime groups, some kind of a affiliation motivation to be a member of that hate crime group. It's not so much bias, but it's affiliation motivation. And all these are valid predictors of group violence or hate crime. And this brings up the question, we have a number of empirically tested theories that can be used for intervention and prevention programs. Which one to choose? I would say here that it makes sense to focus especially on those theories that are based on variables that really can be changed. So most of you will probably not be able to change the capitalist system behind. This is not a variable that has an influence, I'm absolutely sure, but it cannot be changed in an intervention program. To my impression, it is especially what can be done at the community level, what Mark presented yesterday, and in many cases it is possible to focus especially on psychological variables, a person's prejudice, a person's readiness for violence, and affiliation motivations. This is what we can attack in an intervention program. It's also extremely difficult, for example, to go down to biological background variables. This is difficult to change in an intervention program, at least for social scientists. And at second, the question comes up, if the intention is to measure the effect of an anti-hate crime program, what then to measure as effect? Luckily, hate crimes cannot be observed so often. And this has the consequence that even if you have a program that can probably change hate crimes and reduce hate crimes, if the number is so low and it's so difficult to observe, you need other indicators than the direct number of hate crimes. You need proxies. And this is what we often do. In Mark's example, for example, coming from yesterday, one could try to count really if a community is acting against hate crime, is on the long run the number of counted hate crimes really reduce. But it's extremely difficult to demonstrate. Therefore, many of the intervention programs focus on participants, on prejudice and aggression, for example. And we heard examples for that. Yes, please.
I was going to say, the other problem with the counting statistics of reporting of hate crime is actually, for many of us, we want the number of reported hate crimes to go up, because we're not saying that that's the number of crimes, and we obviously don't want the crime numbers to increase, but actual reporting is low. So if you were to see a decrease in the hate crime statistics, my immediate hypothesis is something has gone wrong that is preventing people from feeling able to report. So we often have to say to police when they do big speeches, particularly in one of the areas where I've been working, saying hate crime has gone down, look, we have less. We then say, are you sure? Or is it simply that less reporting has happened?
Yep.
Because we already hear from the speakers yesterday that for some people it's very difficult to make that reporting. So I think it would also be interesting to think about what kind of proxies can we find to really dig down into whether hate crime itself is being reduced or whether...
Yeah.
Because somehow it's a weird thing, because you spend your time wanting the statistics to go up so you can get an accurate picture so that you can then... Yeah.
This concerns, in my terminology, the validity of the indicators that you use. Absolutely right. Is it the validity restricted because there is some kind of adjustment to social desirability answers? Part of that problem you can account for part of that problem if you, in Mark's case, for example, would have a comparison community. And if you don't have any reason to assume that reports in one community are biased and not in the other, if they are biased to the same degree in both communities, you would partial that out, that effect. But this is always the question, especially in those areas where we are talking about the validity of indicators. How far is it really the truth that is indicated by these kind of indicators? Yeah, you're right. I will shortly give an example, and this brings me then to the topic of meta-analysis. I will shortly focus on an example of intervention programs that focus on prejudice and measure the effect of these kind of interventions on proxies like prejudice indicators. And this kind of research is based on two empirically supported, I would say, meta-theories. The one is that prejudice goes back to negative or wrong or destroyed information about the outgroup. This is a very common kind of theory, or summarizing a number of different theories. And the other one is the so-called contact hypothesis. This assumes that prejudice primarily or is also influenced by missing of contact between those holding prejudice and the outgroup. So there is a strong anti-Semitism in regions where no Jews live. This is a basic assumption. And both of these theories can be assumed to be empirically supported, and this implies that an intervention program that is based on information should deliver correct information, or should, like in the value confrontation technique, a technique from the United States, tries to bring attention to contradiction in own values and own knowledges. Yeah.
This is where the good theory is so practical, because just a very quick example. There were several anti-Semitic offenders in Los Angeles who were mandated by court to go work at the Simon Wiesenthal Center as assistants. So they were put into a Museum of Tolerance experience to work for a Jewish organization, a human rights organization. And when I heard this, I thought, what an awful idea, because the contact hypothesis will say there has to be mutual goals, there has to be a sense of equity. And indeed, a couple of the kids went right out and reoffended, because they were made to be the underlings to work for these damn Jews.
Yeah.
And so, so if the people who had done this had really understood the theory, they would have said, we're not going to make these people be subservient to the people that they denigrate, because it's going to amplify the problem. So, the contact hypothesis is such an intriguing idea. And in terms of intervention, such an intriguing idea.
This brings me to the question, how much time do I have?
You're perfect.
You do not know what I'm going to say.
No, you have 10 more minutes to present.
Okay. Then I would say I go shortly into what a meta-analysis is. A meta-analysis in principle is nothing but to bring together different studies by accounting for the size of the sample behind the studies. So usually assume you have two intervention programs, let's say in schools. One which is based on 20 participants, and the other is based on 2,000 participants. Both of them are effective, which can be shown by our statistics. And we also, in addition to a significance test, we can also calculate effect sizes that gives information about the strength of the effect on the dependent variable of interest. And now you have these two studies, one based on 20, one based on 2,000 respondents. If you simply would combine the effect sizes, calculate a mean of effect sizes, you would overestimate the small sample and underestimate the effect that can be observed in the big sample. And what a meta-analysis does in principle, the first goal is to calculate a mean and thereby taking into account the size of the samples that are involved in the 2 or more studies. So this is a kind of mean effect size calculation, taking into account the size behind that kind of calculation. So meta-analysis from a statistical point of view is not really a problem. There are some tricks, I agree, but in principle this is nothing but calculating something like a mean correlation coefficient, which is an effect size indicator. The real problem behind is how to find the original literature that goes into the meta-analysis. So the idea is the meta-analysis summarizes the results from a number of evaluation studies. The problem now is that many evaluation studies are extremely difficult to publish, because from the perspective of a journal editor, a report over a successful evaluation of a certain program is nothing but to report about a case study. This is just one case where a certain intervention has been successful, and from his perspective or her perspective, the editor's perspective, this is not so interesting. And this has a consequence, and in addition there's a second point. Scientific publication journals tend to publish only what successfully supports the theory. So if you run an evaluation and you find out that a certain intervention is not successful, the chances of publishing these kind of results are extremely low. If you now would base your meta-analysis only on the published results, you would dramatically overestimate the effect, because the published results are those who have been positive, and those who did not come out positively are not published, and this would end up in an overestimation of effect. And therefore it is extremely important for a meta-analysis that you do everything to find all relevant studies in the field. And that means you have to look for unpublished studies. And you can imagine this is extremely difficult to do. Our meta-analysis here is based on all studies that have been published up until to the year 2010, which have been published either in English or German. So our intention was to find out all analysis on the topic, how do information programs work, based on all analysis run, not only on the published ones. And what you can see here is what we have. Here you have the number of studies going into this analysis, and you see we have 46 studies that have been published, and there are different kinds of analysis, which is not so much of interest here. So altogether 46 plus 29, it's about 75 studies, published studies, that focus on intervention programs that are based on giving information. So about 75 published studies in the world, published in English and German, up until 2010, that can be found under the published studies. In addition to that, we found 60 plus 19, 79 unpublished studies. And you can imagine how difficult it is to just find these studies. So we wrote to experts in the field. There are dissertation documentations where we went on, and things like that. And this brought up that we have more unpublished studies to that question than published studies. And this increases our security that we at the end will report a valid effect. And these are the results, and the important point here is this effect size indicator, which comes close to a correlation coefficient, and it says, and the stars indicate that this is a significant effect. So using information in a program to prevent prejudice or to reduce prejudice helps with an effect size of 0.28, which is not a big effect, but it is there. The interesting point also is we found some studies, not so many, namely 9, that used a delayed test, in the middle 6 weeks after the program ended. And you see the effect is weaker, but it is still there. So it does not disappear immediately. So much to intervention programs that are based on information. I now come to contact programs. This is
Can I ask
yeah.
a question about actually the last one? Did you
This
say-
one?
No,
the one before.
yeah. When you look at the unpublished
Yeah.
studies, did you do an evaluation of why they were not published?
I would say that often it is the case that these kind of studies do not support the hypothesis that they proclaim in the beginning. But I would say for intervention studies, this is really a problem that evaluation studies, to publish evaluation studies at all, because from the perspective of the editor of a journal, this is a report about there have been some people who made a certain intervention and this worked. What does it tell us about, or what does it tell us about the scientific process behind? And this is really a problem for evaluation studies focusing on interventions.
But I'm guessing that some of the published papers were not very good. And that was
Yeah, it could also be that they are not so good. But by the way,
should they be included in
Yeah.
your
they say
meta-analysis?
such a meta-analysis, this kind of analysis, this one and the following one I'm going to present, is based on about 2,500 documents in the beginning. So the first step that you are doing is to go to the electronic documentations and find out what might fit. And then you reduce the number and end up with 180 or so. And in addition to documenting whether they are published or unpublished, you also try to assess the quality. And then you can differentiate within the meta-analysis, I come back to that in a minute, you can differentiate in the analysis whether the effects are stronger in the qualitatively high analysis or in the bad analysis. You get information about that.
Mr. Wagner, just one question that's related to what David asked. One purpose of meta-analysis can be that the measures in the studies differ very much. So you have to make sure that there are some matchings in with relation to that criteria. These studies you've mentioned here, are they all, of course, they have been the control for these things?
Not all.
No?
This is the difference between primary and secondary cluster. The primary cluster is a control group analysis, is pre-test, post-test.
Okay. How huge was the heterogeneity of the measures in the studies?
Can I come back to that in a minute?
Yeah. Okay.
Because I would now like to go over to intervention programs and their evaluations that are based on the contact hypothesis. In Marburg, we work a lot on the contact hypothesis, and this is the basic assumption of contact hypothesis coming from a American, I have to say, personality psychologist, Gordon Allport, who brought up this idea in 1954, which is an interesting date then, when this book came out. And the basic assumption is that contact, if it's based on equal status, and the groups, contact between different groups, and if the group members pursue a common goal, and if it's sanctioned by institutional support, and if the perception of common interest is given, that this contact will help to reduce tension and prejudice between the groups. And there's a lot of studies on this hypothesis. In 2010, Pettigrew and Trop published a meta-analysis on all studies about that. What we now did, there's a number of studies that tried to demonstrate the validity of this hypothesis, and it can be demonstrated in very different contexts. Even we have a number of studies in Germany. And in addition to that, there is a number of programs, intervention programs to reduce prejudice that is based on the contact hypothesis. So probably best known is the cooperative classroom. Elliot Aronson, for example, is one of the authors, or the Johnsons are people working in this field. And the idea here is to divide a classroom into small groups, let's say of 4 pupils. And within the groups, these groups have to be composed heterogeneous. So that there have to be migrant children as well as real Germans, whatever that might be. And this also implies that these groups are heterogeneous according to achievement, because this is correlated, being a migrant child or an autochthonous population child. And within that group, What these groups then have to work on a common task, and the preconditions for this common task is distributed within the small groups. That means one of the group members, if we take for example, the target of the group is to work on a biography of a famous person, then one group member receives information about early childhood of that person. The other one receives information of early youth, and so on. And you can imagine that this kind of group composition then implies that the members within the small groups have to work together cooperatively. So the condition, all parts conditions are fulfilled. And there's a number of evaluations that show that this really can help to improve intergroup relations, to reduce prejudice, and in addition, by the way, to improve achievement, especially of minority children, which is a very important additional effect. We now analyzed all these programs based on contact hypothesis in a second meta-analysis. And what you can see here, we found about 75 to 79, about 120 international studies that evaluated the effect of contact programs. And what you can also see, are the effect sizes and the significance of the effect, that these kind of intervention studies work and that they have an effect size of 0.26, and even if the effect is tested with a delay after the program ended, it is still valid. And now I come to some of your questions. The meta-analysis is not only able to check for a mean effect size, is there an effect or not? It is also possible to check for heterogeneity in the effect size. So is this a homogeneous effect, or is this an effect that is composed of studies which have a much stronger effect and studies that have a much weaker effect, or studies that have a good indicator of the dependent variables and studies that have a bad indicator? So if that heterogeneous indicator is significant, it tells us that the studies going into this effect size are different or differ from each other. And this then gives reason to look for reasons for that difference. And an example of that is presented here. And I would like to attend to this first differentiation. This is a differentiation how far contact interventions work for majorities or for minorities. And what you can see for both, the contact effect is there, it is significant. But if you have a majority member going into a contact program, the effect is much bigger, 0.37, compared to a minority member going into a contact intervention. And if you think about that for a second, it makes sense. Because being a minority implies that you are very often in contact with the majority, even without such a program, because you are a minority, if you do not live in a totally segregated society, assuming that. But for a majority, it may be a total new information to come into contact with a minority. I got a sign that I have to stop. And this brings me to my second last overhead. One problem with evaluations of interventions is to communicate them, both within the scientific community, and this is a problem that editors are not interested in evaluations of interventions, but also to the general public. We have to find a way to communicate them and not let them disappear as black publications somewhere. Nobody knows. This is really a real problem. There's a number of knowledge in the field, but it cannot be found. And at second, these kinds of information have to be summarized in kind of meta-analysis, because this really gives you some security. If you find over 120 studies, and these are about 15,000 respondents participating in these studies, if it works, and if you can also in addition differentiate between minority, majority, for example, we have a number of further differentiations. If you can do that, if you can demonstrate it, you can be much more sure that there's really an effect, and you can recommend, for example, to plan contact interventions because they have been proven in the past to be effective. So this is, we have to find a means to do that, really to do that, if we are talking about bringing science to the public and to politicians. My final point is, all this, you cannot do all this, that means evaluation for nothing. What we often experience is that we are contacted by people who plan an intervention, who plan a prevention program, ask us to run an evaluation, and then they have to declare that they received no money for that. And this does not work, because this is really a hard work to do a good evaluation. And we have also to bring that to the awareness of the public and of politicians who have to pay for that. This is the end.